Welcome back to Galaxy Tenants. My name is Carly, and co-producing this episode is my husband, Jay. On episode 11, we feature a conversation with pilot Dusty Spangler and a song from one of our favorite bands, Lotus.
I'm here with my friend, Dusty Spangler, who is a pilot. Can you give us a little more specifics into your title?
Yeah, my title right now is first officer, which is basically the guy that sits in the right seat of a jet for an airline. The guy in the left seat's the captain. So currently I'm a first officer for Spirit Airlines.
How did you get into becoming a pilot? Is this something you've wanted to do since you were young? Because I feel like a pilot is one of those jobs that, like, as a little kid, you want to be like a firefighter, a police officer, a pilot. And so for me as an adult, I always have that fantasy of being a pilot and flying. And how did you come upon being a pilot?
Yeah, I think for a lot of, American males, growing up watching those obnoxious movies, like not just Top Gun, but like, I don't know if you remember, what was it, Iron Eagle, or some of those real bad 80s kind of Top Gun ripoff movies. I guess flying's always in your head. For me, my dad was an Air Force pilot, so I grew up on Air Force bases around pilots. So it was kind of something I was exposed to early on. And how I went about getting all my flight ratings was majoring in aviation at a college. University of North Dakota had a large aviation program, and that's where I got my flight training and my degree.
Wow. So you grew up on military bases?
Yeah, I grew up on Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, and then we moved to Andrews Air Force Base in the mid-'90s. My dad flew Air Force Two for Vice President Gore, for Al Gore.
Wow.
And he did that for a few years. And, my dad's career, he's the one you should be interviewing. He's actually here today at my home in Florida, or he's at his condo. We both have a condo in the same community. But
that's cool.
His career, he's the real guy you should be interviewing. But I'll take it. I'll take it for now. But yeah, he flew Air Force Two, and he basically went to every civilized capital in the world. If anywhere that in any Secretary of State or the Vice President went, he went. So his passport at the time, he had a diplomatic passport that had about every stamp from every capital you could imagine in it. And when he left the Air Force, they kept it and shredded it. He wasn't allowed to keep it. He was very upset about that because he had so many countries that he'd been to in that job. So anyway, I grew up around that environment, and then he went to American Airlines after the military. So I had a sense of what being an airline pilot entailed as far as the lifestyle, the pay, and it just seemed like something that I wanted to try to get into.
So what does it take to become a pilot? You need a college education, and then from there, I would assume some very specific training.
You don't need a college degree for it. There's two traditional ways that people used to get into this profession. One was the military. So to be a pilot in the military, you would need a 4-year degree. You need to be an officer. And you need to qualify for the program. That used to be really difficult, back when my dad did pilot training in the early 80s. Nowadays, they really need pilots. So anyone out there, any of your listeners has ever been interested in that, if you have a 4-year degree in anything, you can be an officer and can get into the flight program. So usually the age limit's 27. You can get age waivers up to like 30, 31, something like that. So that's the military route, right? Those guys, that's probably at least a 10-year commitment if you want to be a pilot in the military. The other route is the civilian route. And, you live in Denver. You could go to, Rocky Mountain Metro Airport and go to a flight school and just start flight training tomorrow. It's like any skill set. You need time and you need money to get it done. So, the first step is to get a private pilot certificate, right? That costs probably anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 depending on which flight school you choose, and it's on the minimum about 40 hours of flight training, and then you have ground school on top of that. So that's your first rating. Then you have to get your instrument rating. Then you have to get your commercial certificate. Then a multi-engine rating, and then you have all these ratings, and then you need to find a job, right? Well, how do you get a job? You need flight time. How do you get flight time? Nobody hires you because you don't have any experience. So there's definitely a lot of barriers to entry. But the two main things you need to get into it are time and money, I would say. From start to finish, you probably need, on the low end, $60,000, $70,000 to do all your flight training. On the high end, if you went to one of those schools such as ATP, it could be 100, 120,000, but you can get done in like a year and a half. Like you do it every day. So those are the two big barriers of getting in, is really just time and money, and then getting the flight time to get that first job.
Sure. Are you flying pretty consistently post-pandemic here, or now that we're in a pandemic? Are you still flying? Have you been laid off? How does that work?
Well, in the airline industry, we were lucky enough to get a bailout, and part of that bailout is if your airline accepted bailout money, they're not allowed to furlough until September 30th. So for right now, my job is safe, which is a lot more than most people can say. I'm anticipating getting furloughed in September. I hope it doesn't happen. A lot of it's going to depend on how demand returns in the fall, end of summer in the fall, if people start flying again. Right now, as an industry, our demand's down 95%. So, the amount of, layoffs and furloughs that airlines need to do to right size for that kind of an environment is pretty significant. But now hopefully the demand comes back. And, it just depends on how many pilots airlines need to cut and flight attendants. And then it's a seniority system. So, if I have 500 guys beneath me and they lay off 450, then I'll be safe. If they lay off 501, then I'm going to get furloughed. And then when you're furloughed, you're laid off, but you can be recalled. As soon as the airline starts hiring again, they have to recall all furloughed people before they bring in new people in the door. So you still have your seniority number, you still have your spot. It's just a matter of, when the company needs those crew members again. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. So are you still flying then pretty regularly at Current? And if so, what do those flights look like?
When this whole thing started, I would say loads were pretty steady. Like I'm talking when did this start? Middle of March? Is that when this started?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say, the first few weeks, Disney World is still open. I work for an airline where, our big bases are Fort Lauderdale and Orlando. So we're taking people to the cruise industry, the cruise ships, right? We're taking people to the amusement parks, kind of more of a leisure airline, really. So, when those things are still going, our loads are pretty steady. And by that, I mean, 150 people, 200 people. But then every week it started to reduce. So then finally, when we went into shutdown mode, I was having flights where, maybe I'd have 20 people on the flight on an airplane that holds 228. So talk about social distancing. We definitely had that covered on those flights. So obviously airlines, it doesn't make any sense to be burning jet fuel and running airplanes empty. So flights started to get canceled and the schedule started getting reduced. So no, I haven't been flying much this last month. And next month I'm on reserve, which is basically on call, and don't anticipate flying a whole lot then. So, the only thing we can hope for is that, the country can open back up and people can slowly get back to work and try to pick up the pieces, and maybe demand will come back. I think there's going to be some pent up demand. I'm sure you want to take a trip somewhere, probably, right?
Everywhere.
So everyone I talked to said the first thing I'm doing is taking a flight somewhere, to a beach or something. So I hope we're able to do that. It just depends on how everything turns out. It's such a weird crisis.
How can I'm just trying to think of this logistically. I know there are going to be some solutions, but when I think of an airliner, I'm trying to think of, is there recycled air? How close can people sit? How do you social distance? Do you mandate masks? And I know I've seen a couple airlines have started to mandate masks, as have a bunch of stores and whatnot. And maybe this isn't a question for you to answer, but I'm curious as to how the airlines make consumers and passengers feel safe again.
Yeah, that's the whole key. After 9/11, people had to feel safe before they wanted to fly again. So it's going to be a very similar challenge for the industry this time. The airplanes don't recycle air. We cycle the air through. Yeah, so, we've already been cleaning the airplanes really well. The airplanes cycle the air through. It's not recycled air. We have very, sophisticated filters on the airplanes that can filter out, a lot of toxins, and they're built basically for smoke. But yeah, there's a lot of things we can do. People wearing masks. JetBlue just required all their passengers to wear masks. People in Asia have been wearing masks traveling for years. They've dealt with a lot of these pandemics, before we have. So there's a way to do it, but ultimately people need to have money to go fly, right? And you have millions of people laid off. That's not going to help. So it's going to be, most airline executives are saying it's going to be at least 2 to 3 years before we return back to 2019 levels of flying.
Sure.
Making people feel safe to fly. I think the demand's going to be there, but yeah, it's, when are the amusement parks going to open up? When are the concerts going to start? When are the sporting events? Think about all the reasons you need to travel, not to mention all your business travel. So there's just so many factors that go into it, which is why, as an industry, it's probably airlines are going to be smaller probably this next year, and it's just a matter of how small are we going to get, and how long does it take to recall people who end up getting furloughed. So it's a tough time, but it's a tough time for everybody.
Yeah, it is. What are the most challenging aspects of your job? And that can be pre and post COVID. Just what are some of the most challenging aspects of what you do?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things, in the industry is just not having that consistent time at home, not having that consistent routine. So a typical monthly schedule for a pilot is 4-day trips, right? You do a 4-day trip, and then you can be off for 2 days, you can be off for 4 days, but it's not every month it changes. It's not a set schedule. So just having that set routine, if you're a creature of routine, it's probably not a great job for you. If you're someone like me who likes to see different things and have a job where I'm, outside looking out a window at 35,000 feet and staying in hotels, which I don't mind even after the pandemic, it's a pretty cool lifestyle, and there's definitely pros and cons. I would say the biggest drawback is that lack of stability at home. So you really have to have people around you that are okay with that type of lifestyle, because it's definitely not for everyone.
To me, there's something super romantic about flying around through the skies and staying in a bunch of different hotels and traveling to a bunch of different cities. I can also see what you're saying about the downside as far as regularity. What are your favorite aspects of the job?
One of the cool things about being in the airline industry, I mean, there's different types of flight jobs, right? You could be fly a private jet for a rich family or for a corporation. You can fly air ambulance, for a hospital, in a Learjet, for example, or a King Air. You can do aerial photography where you're flying out there by yourself. One of the cool things about being in the airlines is just working with the different crew members. I've worked with flight attendants who are, had their master's degrees and spoke 4 languages. I've worked with captains who own breweries. You just meet so many different people. So I would say the people that you work with make a big difference. One of the weird things that I thought was interesting when I first, put on an airline uniform that I didn't really expect is when you walk through an airport, people will just get out of your way, which is kind of cool. Like they always think you're going somewhere important, like you're going to be late, when really I'm just like going to the Starbucks or going to the bathroom, but they kind of just like move out of the way. So I've kind of gotten to the point where I like to travel in my uniform, because everyone, like the gate agents, just treat you like you're a celebrity, so that's kind of a weird thing, but that's something I like. It's just, walking around the airport, going to the airplane. I fly an Airbus right now, and it's an awesome airplane, really roomy flight deck, lots of room to put your bags, and it's got a fun like flow to it. Like when you get to an airplane, you pretty much do the same procedures every flight. So I'll get to the airplane, I'll do my preliminary checks in the flight deck. I'll go do a walk around on the exterior of the airplane and look for anything that could be broke, or any maybe they hit a bird strike, or whatever whatever it could be. Checking the tires. You come back in, you do some more checklists, you do a briefing with the captain, you brief the flight attendants, you do your pre-pushback check. They push you back, you start the engines, you take off, cruise, you do the descent, and every flight follows the same logical procedure. So there's it's fun when you get good at it, and when it's just everything becomes second nature and you're not really thinking about what you're doing. Everything is just kind of natural. It's probably like a musician who's just kind of has been playing the same song 1,000 times. You can really just kind of lean into it and enjoy it and look out in the audience. That's kind of what I feel like flying is. Once you get used to the airplane and get used to the procedures, you can really look out the window and just enjoy the view. I've had flights where I've taken off from Atlanta going to LA at sunset, and you're just chasing the sunset for like 4 hours. It's like a 4-hour sunset.
That sounds incredible.
So just things like that. Those are the things I like about the job.
Whereas procedurally, the approach might be similar aircraft by aircraft. How do they fly? Is there a big range in how they feel when you're in the sky, aircraft to aircraft? Yeah,
definitely. And that takes time to get the feel of that. So if you're flying a single engine Cessna, that's going to fly different than a multi-engine, 2-engine, piston aircraft. A jet's going to feel different than a piston aircraft. Different size jets are going to have different feels. I flew a jet that, CRJ, which was a 50-seat jet before I flew the Airbus, and flying an Airbus, it's a fly-by-wire system. So it's, the stick is controlled electronically to the flight controls. And so it has there's different resistance for that, compared to a jet, just different type of jet. So it's just, every airplane has a different feel to it, and it takes, probably takes a couple 100 hours to really get comfortable in a new airplane.
You mentioned bird strike earlier. How often does something like that happen? And have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're like, oh crap? Have you ever had like an incident per se?
Yeah, every pilot has their own little stories. One thing they teach you early on in training is aviate, navigate, communicate. So the first thing is always just fly the airplane. So something weird happens, instead of trying to diagnose a problem, we're just going to fly the airplane to make sure the airplane's still flying correctly. If it's still flying correctly, whatever you're dealing with is not really an emergency, right? So maybe you hear a noise or feel a shudder. You look down at your instruments, everything's working normally. Everything's fine. Navigate, make sure you know where you are. Do you need to return to the airport or can you continue on? And then communicate, communicating with your crew members, air traffic control, with your company. So that's always a priority, aviate, navigate, communicate. There's a lot of things in aviation that kind of relate to the real world, we use CRM, crew resource management. It's all about communicating with somebody and sending your message across clearly and making sure they verify that you understand. Something that's pretty useful, like in a relationship, probably, right? When you're communicating with a partner. There's a saying in aviation, never let the airplane go someplace your mind hasn't been 15 minutes prior, So that's always something that you're always thinking about what's next, what's ahead. And that's something that's kind of useful in your normal life. You mentioned bird strike. I remember for my last airline, I was a captain. Sometimes what people don't understand is that there's a lot of moving parts in aviation. And sometimes things don't work, and sometimes you have delays. And I know it's hard for people to understand that when they really want to get somewhere. But, just to give you an example, I was landing in Saginaw, Michigan, and CRJ, regional jet, holds 76 people. And we had a bird strike, on the leading edge of the wing, and it's a bird strike because there's remains on the wing and there's blood. And every time you have to have a bird strike, you have to get a maintenance guy to come out and inspect it, So being this was a small airport, there was no maintenance on the field. So we had to call a contract maintenance guy who had to drive 2 hours. So, walking out to the terminal as a captain, I'm, on the mic explaining the situation. And I had a guy come up to me, and he was, pretty well put together businessman. DuPont has their headquarters near this area, and I think he was like an executive or something. And he just let me have it about how upset he was. He's going to miss his connecting flight to, overseas somewhere. And he was just really, really upset. And, there's times in the business, just like any job, where you just got to sit there and take it. And, you can explain it any way you want to, but someone's going to miss their connecting flight and their day's ruined. It's a tough thing for them to process. But as crew members, we got to do. There's a very specific reason why we have to call maintenance for certain issues and make sure the plane's not damaged. So
yeah, of course. That's a safety issue. You're protecting this guy. You're keeping this guy's safety at heart, and he's going to bitch you out for missing his next flight.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one thing I learned with this job is I've had a lot of experience with passengers. Like this particular guy, I kind of sat there and let him kind of lay into me, and this is in front of a bunch of other people too. And I just kind of sat there and took it because that's your job as captain. Sometimes you just gotta take it, And after he kind of let me have it, he calmed down a little bit, and he told me that this was like the third flight in a row where he had a delay. So there's always people always have whenever I get an upset passenger come up to me in the airport, I always just try to remember that they've had this whole long journey before they got to me. They probably woke up at 4 a.m, got to the airport. Parking was more expensive than they thought. TSA took longer than they thought. There's no food open yet. Then they just, and they have this whole journey before they got to me. And me, I usually wake up from a pretty good night of sleep in a hotel and probably had a workout the night before and sat in the hot tub. And I'm feeling pretty good when I get to the airport. I'm not really I don't really go through normal security. Like they scan my badge and I walk right through. I already have my coffee. I'm just kind of fat, dumb, and happy.
What's the craziest thing that you've ever experienced as a pilot?
Craziest thing I ever experienced as a pilot. So I told you before that you have to get flight time to be an airline pilot. Well, how do you get flight time? who's going to hire you when you're a brand new pilot with 250 hours of flight time, right? Nobody's really going to hire you to fly passengers with that, really. So you have to find a way to get flight time. Some people, maybe their family owned an airplane. They can go fly their family airplane. For other people, you got to find that job. And maybe it's banner towing, towing a banner over the beaches of Florida, or towing a banner over Dick's Sporting Goods during a fish show or something, Maybe it's doing aerial surveying. So you could do, there's jobs where you can, map different areas with an airplane. Oil companies hire guys to do pipeline patrol. So you're up there flying by yourself. So you need flight time. You need 1,500 hours to fly for an airliner, right? Minimum. So the way I got flight time was I became a flight instructor. I went on this pilot job board called Climb to 350, and they were advertising flight instructor jobs in Merced, California, free housing. And so I went out there, and that was my first flight job. And I was living in a dorm, and it was training Chinese and Vietnamese students how to fly from start to finish. So a private pilot all the way up through commercial, multi-engine. So one of my students I had from Vietnam, we were flying out of Los Banos, California, and we took off, and it was a Cessna. And the Cessna 152 had electronic flaps, and we took off, and the flaps didn't raise, after takeoff. And what flaps do is, they basically increase drag. So if you can't get the flaps up, you're not going to be able to climb properly, right? So we were doing touch and goes. We did a landing, we took off again, and the flaps would come up. And again, we're barely getting off the ground. I'm a pretty big guy, and this student was pretty big, and Cessna's pretty small. It's summertime, and we're sluggish, and the airplane is just not flying the way it's supposed to fly. It doesn't feel the way it's supposed to feel. And so we're about 200 feet off the ground. We're barely climbing, and it kind of goes back to that same old thing: aviate, navigate, communicate, and just trying to fly the airplane and then diagnosing the problem. I looked out, realized the flaps weren't coming up, the flap handle wasn't working, and we basically just we could only get to about 500 feet, and I basically just circled around the airport, came back, and landed. And of all the flights I've had, at the professional level, that one right there with a student was probably the scariest moment I had, because I just didn't understand what was happening. The airplane wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and luckily me and the student both kind of got through it together. But I can't imagine what the student was feeling. He had like 20 hours of training. He definitely didn't know what was going on. But but that was the scariest thing I had, probably. As working as a pilot. For the airlines, when we have system failures in those jets, there's so many backup systems, it's usually not a big problem. Probably just had some cases where I flew too close to some bad weather and maybe got a little too shook up by the turbulence and what I was expecting. If people want to become pilots, if you have listeners that are interested in doing it, the best thing for them to do is just go to the airport and start hanging around the airport and start talking to people. If you know someone who's a pilot, reach out to them, get advice. It's definitely an industry where we all need mentors. We all have mentors, and we all become mentors, in this profession. So that'd be my best advice, is go hang out at the airport. My first job in aviation was pumping gas. I was basically fueling jets at the Denver Air Center at Rocky Mountain Metro Airport. That was my first job, before I got my first flying job. And I just did that job because I wanted to be around airplanes and be around those people. So I guess that's my best advice, is to really try to seek out those mentors.
I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Dusty, and I really appreciate the work you do, and stay safe while you're out and about. And I'd love to circle back with you and have a future conversation post-pandemic and see how things are changing and developing. But again, grateful for your time. Thanks for doing this, bud.
Yeah, thank you for doing it too. It's good to hear some new content out there during this pandemic. I've been checking out your stuff, and it's been great.
We leave you with a song from Lotus titled Fortune Favors. Thank you for listening to Galaxy Tenants. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, like, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.